In a remote Hmong village deep in the mountains of Laos, life moved slowly, untouched by the outside world. The people lived as their ancestors had for generations, far from the reach of modern civilization. It was just before the Vietnam War, and the village remained a quiet haven, surrounded by dense jungle and steep cliffs. But this tranquility was shattered when Pao, a respected elder, passed away suddenly in his sleep. His death was a shock to the villagers, who revered him for his wisdom and strength. The illness that took him had been swift and mysterious, leaving them with a deep sense of unease. According to tradition, the villagers began the funeral rites, which would last 5 days, inside Pao's home. Without electricity, the house was lit only by oil lamps and candles, their dim light casting eerie shadows on the bamboo walls. Pao's body was laid on a simple bench made of bamboo, in the center of his house. The villagers gathered around, offering prayers and making offerings to ensure his soul's safe passage to the afterlife. But from the beginning, something felt wrong. The air inside the house was heavy and cold, an unnatural chill that seeped into the bones. On the second day, a foul odor began to fill the house. At first, it was faint, but by the third day, the stench had grown unbearable. Pao's body, once peaceful in death, had begun to rot at an alarming rate. His skin, darkened and cracked, exposed decaying flesh underneath, and flies buzzed around him incessantly. The villagers whispered among themselves, their fear growing with each passing hour. The nights were the worst. Without the hum of electricity, the village was plunged into complete darkness, broken only by the faint glow of the oil lamps. On the fourth night, the jungle that surrounded the village fell silent, as if the animals themselves were holding their breath. The villagers stayed awake, their eyes fixed on Pao's body, afraid of what might happen next. As dawn approached on the fifth day, just before the final rites were to be performed, the unthinkable happened. Pao's body, which had lain motionless for days, suddenly began to twitch. The bamboo bench creaked under his weight as his limbs jerked and convulsed. The villagers, frozen in terror, watched as Pao's decayed eyes snapped open, revealing empty, soulless voids. A low, guttural moan escaped his rotting lips, and the stench in the room intensified, nearly choking those who stood too close. Without warning, Pao's body sat upright. His movements were stiff and unnatural, as if he were being pulled by invisible strings. The villagers gasped and stumbled back, but Pao didn't seem to notice them. Instead, he slowly stood up from the bench, his feet thudding heavily on the bamboo floor. With a staggering gait, Pao turned toward the door. The villagers, too terrified to move, watched as he pushed open the wooden door and stepped out into the early morning light. He moved slowly but with purpose, heading toward the dense jungle that surrounded the village. The villagers watched in stunned silence as Pao's decaying form disappeared into the trees, his rotting figure swallowed by the shadows of the mountain. Fear gripped the village. For days after Pao's disappearance, an uneasy silence hung over the community. The jungle remained eerily quiet, and the villagers kept to their homes, afraid of what might happen next. But the nights brought no peace. Dogs, usually calm and loyal, began barking furiously at the darkness, their eyes wide with fear as they stared toward the mountains. Chickens, kept in small coops next to the houses, started disappearing without a trace, leaving behind only scattered feathers. The villagers whispered that Pao's spirit was still among them, angry and vengeful, haunting the village that had once been his home. No one dared to go into the mountains, fearing that Pao's body was still wandering among the trees. Some believed he had become a vengeful spirit, cursed to roam the land he once loved. Others thought his disappearance was an omen, a sign of the horrors that would soon be brought by the war creeping ever closer. The fear grew until, one night, a group of villagers decided to leave offerings at the edge of the jungle, hoping to appease Pao's restless spirit. They left food, incense, and small trinkets, praying for his forgiveness. But the offerings were untouched, and the fear continued to grow. The nights remained restless, the dogs barking echoing through the village, and more chickens disappeared. The villagers knew they were not alone, something dark and malevolent was out there, watching, waiting. And so, they lived in fear, knowing that the mountains held a secret that would never be revealed, but would haunt them for generations to come.